take all that and we're going to quit drinking. And they're wrong too. So the big book attacks this problem for us, and it starts out in chapter 3 detailing for us the Let's recap. Last week we took a look at the second step, and we began our discussion by considering what it is which is meant by this term being restored to sanity. Because many people have difficulty with the idea that we have some species of insanity here. After all, isn't it true that we just drink too much? And that our problem is alcohol, and if we could just stop drinking, we'd be fine. No, that's not it. Not if you are, as I am, a real alcoholic, a chronic alcoholic. Because we have something far beyond this alcohol problem. Our minds don't work right. Well, to put it simply, we're screwy when we come in the door. Because our minds have stopped working properly, and we need to have the restoration of our sanity in order for us to recover. But we can't do this ourselves, because you don't cure a sick mind with a sick mind, do you? Many people try. And there's a lot of professionals out there who have it in their mind that they're going to be able to cure us, because they're going to get us sane, and then all of a sudden, since we know so much about why we drink and all about ourselves and our feelings and our background and the people who have abused us and on and on and on and on, that we're just going to take all that and we're going to quit drinking. And they're wrong too. So the big book attacks this problem for us, and it starts out in chapter 3 detailing for us the essence of the insanity of that first drink. And to do that, remember last week we discussed there are two stories, Fred and Jim in the 3rd chapter, and the allegory of the jaywalker. And these two stories illustrate the insanity which accompanies this disease of alcoholism, seems to be part and parcel of it. One of the symptoms, if you will. And the allegory of the jaywalker is something which most of us can identify with, and demonstrates the utter idiocy of taking the next drink when we know what the hell is going to happen to us. We're going to break out in handcuffs. We're going to lose everything we have. We're going to be held up to ridicule. Everything that happened in the past is going to happen again, but our mind tells us it ain't so. This time you can get away with it. Just go have a couple of drinks. You deserve it. Just take the edge off. And then 8, 10 drinks later, we sit there and say, what in the hell happened here? Why did I do this again? Oh, well, I might just as well go ahead and get drunk now. I've gone this far. Or we go into the bar and we say to the bartender, I'm an alcoholic. You know, that's the nature of alcoholics to drink alcohol. Give me a drink. And there's a whole bunch of people sitting around, all of our friends. They say, oh yeah, we're alcoholics too. Who's got a joke? Or what's on the tube? What game is playing today? Where are those chicken wings? Where are those girls with the big bosoms? Let's all get it on here. Let's have a party. And we're sitting at home one night and we know we can't drink at all, and we're getting kind of low, and we figure, well, you see, one time in 1982, when I went out to a bar, I picked up a woman, and it was sure great. I know this is 2001, but gee, maybe there's one out there waiting for me still. You know, hope springs eternal. I mean, what the hell? We don't forget, unfortunately, that it was the alcohol which removed from us the overwhelming fear with which we grew up and which was our constant companion. We remember that it was the release from that fear which was the most delicious feeling we'd had, most exquisite feeling of all, the release from the pain of fear, and being able to then function at the social level that we always wanted to be able to do. And We always thought we got to be better drivers and better everything. And look at Ernest Hemingway. He became a great writer because he was a drunk. And, you know, you can rationalize this stuff all you want. But the fact is that though at very first it might have been wonderful to have a bunch of drinks and be able to get out there and make a damn fool of ourselves, and we didn't care, and everybody else laughed, and we didn't realize they were laughing at us most of the time, but we thought we were accepted, and that's what we wanted. We wanted to be accepted. We wanted to be a part of our peer group. And so we remember those things. We romanticize those things. And it's all part of this. It's all part of this insanity. Now, chapter 3 also does a couple more things for us. It illustrates two other extremely important points. Number one, that we do not get sober because we have attained great knowledge about ourselves. Self-knowledge does not do it. And this is the short circuit for all of our professional friends out there who use the human solution to our recovery. They believe firmly that they can just help us get straightened out so that we know why we drink and learn all about our emotions and our feelings, and they teach us we're entitled to our feelings, and they teach us all about appropriate anger and fear, which is healthy, and all this stuff. They teach us things like you're only as sick as your secrets. But what they forgot was that if you turn that around and say, well, wait, if I don't have any secrets, you mean I'm well? Probably not. And so self-knowledge doesn't keep us sober. We have illustrations of that from every side, of course, and many of you have experienced it yourself. I remember in 1970 when the federal government started to fund treatment centers, and CARE Unit came in out in California, and they set up a wonderful program of psychological counseling and all kinds of different stuff, and they were going to get everybody sober. Their recidivism rate was 100%, and they couldn't figure out why. And it took them about 3 years to decide that they better get AA into the act if they plan to have anybody get sober. So it's pretty clear that self-knowledge will not keep us sober. And the other lesson we have to learn here is that fear will not keep us sober. Fear does not keep us sober. And you hear all the time stuff like you got to keep it green. If you don't remember your last drunk, you haven't had it. Half of us had our last drunk in a blackout. You know, the idea that somehow we are going to stay permanently sober because we're afraid of the results of the next drink is ludicrous. And yet this is the kind of thing that gets bandied about so much, and we need to read the book and hear what it says. That fear will not keep us sober. It's just the converse. Fear is our enemy. Fear is our great enemy. Fear is our only enemy. Franklin Roosevelt said it best, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Fear it is that's warped and perverted our natural God-given instincts so they no longer function on our behalf. They work against us. They have contributed to our failures in life and our failures in our relationships and our failures in business. Those natural instincts have gone wild, and thereby lies the rest of the tale of this insanity. Since our minds no longer function as God intended, we no longer think as a natural, normal person would think. And these natural instincts for sex, security, and society have been warped out of sight by fear. Now, we cannot cure these things ourselves. The Big Book makes it clear, and we'll talk about this next week, that, for example, selfishness and self-centeredness is something which, strive as we might, we cannot get rid of it on our own. This selfishness and self-centeredness is a direct result of the warping of our natural instincts. We have to have God's help. We are as powerless over selfishness as we are over alcohol. We're as powerless over resentments as we are over alcohol. We're as powerless over fears as we are over alcohol. We're as powerless over dishonesty as we are over alcohol. We have to have God's help with these things to be free of them. Now, what does the second step say? that we came to believe that God could do that for us. We came to believe that God could restore us to sanity. Not that He will, because there's much work left to be done, but that He can, that He has the power. And so in order for us to reach that point, we have a long way to go. If we've gotten past the idea and the antipathy toward this concept of insanity, if we've come to accept the fact that our minds don't work right, and okay, let's get it on from here and see what we need to do about it, the next Rubicon that has to be crossed over is this question of a higher power, question of God. In order for us to properly assess this question of God and our belief in God and the coming of faith, we need to look back to Bill's story, because it all starts right back there. Now you remember that Bill was not an atheist by any means, probably not even an agnostic in the sense that he did not know whether there was a God or not. But his teaching and his training, his belief system was that God, if there is a God out there, probably is, but he's responsible for the universe, for all these millions and billions of heavenly bodies that are floating around out there and circling each other, and He's responsible for the creation of all of this and probably doing as much, He's probably running it okay. But wait a second. How can I possibly accept as a truism that this massive power capable of creating and managing the universe would have any interest in me, a personal interest in me, as just one paltry little human being stuck here on a minor planet, circling a minor sun in a sea of billions, maybe trillions of other worlds. And yet, that's what these people are saying. When we walk in the door here, that's what they're saying. They're talking about a God personal to them. Now, how in the world are we going to make that transition? Not only that, but when I walked in the door, I was scared to death of God. I'd had probably a God in my childhood, and many of us have been taught that that God was going to get us. If we screwed up, we were dead ducks. And there was some kind of a fiery place out there. It was either going to be a lake of fire or a barren landscape of ice and snow with guys with horns running around with pitchforks sticking us in the butt every 10 minutes. Oh, that reminds me, I forgot. You know, I got to tell you a story. I hope you'll pardon my digression. See, this alcoholic died, and he went, unfortunately, he was consigned to the lower level. And he met the devil, and he said to the devil, "I'm really scared of this. I've heard some terrible stories about this place." The devil said, "Well, this isn't really so bad." He said, "As a matter of fact, you got 3 choices here. Let me show you what your 3 choices are." So he opened the first door into one part of hell. And here were the moaning souls, and there's fire, and it was terrible, and it was hot, and they were all naked, and they were chained to rocks and stuff, and there were all these little imps running around sticking them with pitchforks. So he said, "I don't think I want that one, sir." So they opened the next door up, and here was a freezing place, and these people were all naked, and they were freezing that you could see that their toes were falling off, and there were still a bunch of imps running around sticking with pitchforks. And he said, "I don't think I want this one, sir." And so the devil said, "You're an alcoholic, aren't you?" And he said, "Oh, yes, sir." He said, "You're going to like this one." So he opened it up, the door, and there was this great lake of excrement. But the poor souls in there were all standing around, and there were waiters passing among them, handing out drinks. And they were all tossing down the drinks and having a wonderful cocktail party. And the alcoholic said, "Well, boy, this is the place for me. I can live with the smell." And the devil said, "Well, that's good, but wait a second." He pulled out a whistle. He blew the whistle, and he said, "Time's up, back on your heads." So anyway, this was the kind of thing that we were afraid of. And you know, most of us most of us have done some pretty rotten, nasty things. When we went against our moral beliefs, we went against our ethical beliefs, we knew what we're supposed to do and we didn't do it. And we walk in the door, almost everybody who walks in that door is loaded with guilt and remorse and shame for the things they've done. And so some of us don't even want to hear this business about God at all. Now there's a kind of a rumor that goes around here, if you take a brand new person just walking in the door and you talk to God about them, they're going to turn tail and run right back out. Well, that's a bunch of baloney. That's crazy. The person who walks in that door who isn't so desperate they're going to accept what we have to offer is not going to stick around very long anyway, whether you mention God to them or not. That's why the big book tells us at that first meeting with a newcomer, one of the things we do is stress the spiritual freely. If we're going to tell them how we recovered, what are we going to do? Tell them I recovered because I've joined this most wonderful encounter group? And there are a lot of people here get to call me on my stuff every time I mess up. And then I got this wonderful counselor who fills me full of pills and shots. If we're going to tell them how we recovered in here, we're going to tell them about God, aren't we? We're going to tell them we have found a spiritual solution to a spiritual problem. So we find that we have these folks and that this is a dilemma. Now the big book always gives us an answer, you know, when it states the problem and then gives us the answer. And the problem here is that we have many folks who are afraid of God or perhaps are in fact agnostic or even in fact atheists. I can't imagine how tough it must be to be an atheist. You have to remind yourself about 10 times a day that none of this could possibly have happened by reason of a God. It would all have to be just by pure chance. Must be awful hard work to be an atheist. But anyway, the big book says, okay, we're going to need to meet this problem head on because there are a lot of folks who came in the first couple, 3 years were agnostic and had a lot of trouble with this. And my namesake, Jim B., he was a flat-out atheist. I think he was also a communist, but nobody's ever accused him of it. He certainly had some weird ideas. He and Bill had some massive fights in order to get the big book written. Well, let's turn to page 44 and see what it says about this now. To one who feels, this is the second full paragraph, to one who feels he's an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible, but to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. Now remember, back in the second chapter, it told us this, that we have two alternatives. That's all. When people say, oh boy, I love it in here, I get choices today. Well, here are the choices. One is to go on to bitter end, blotting out the terrible present and the awful past as best we can. And the other is to accept spiritual help. Those are the choices we have. And so it tells us here that this is not always an easy choice. But it says it's not so difficult. About half our original fellowship were exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope that we were not true alcoholics. Boy, is that familiar, huh? But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. I'd like to point out to you that every time the word must is used in the big book, it means or else. And I think there are 63 of them, so don't anybody tell you there are no musts in the big book. There's a hell of a lot more had tos than there are musts. They all mean the same thing. The or else means death or lifetime incarceration or insanity. Perhaps it's going to be that way with you, but cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. Now, this next paragraph states, the next two paragraphs state the problem. This is the problem we're faced with coming in here in terms of a higher power. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might. But the needed power wasn't there. The needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Can you imagine how futile it is to say to somebody who's just brand new, okay, just don't drink and go to meetings? Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Why do we say this? Why are we not willing to be honest with the new person? If you want recovery, what we offer are 12 steps, spiritual principles, restated as steps of action. Why do we say to them, just don't drink and go to meetings? Don't drink if your butt falls off. Put it in a little red wagon and drag it to a meeting. You've all heard that stuff. Our human resources, which is what we're appealing to now. Take your willpower and will yourself not to drink. No matter what happens, you don't pick up. But Mr. Sponsor, I just had an awful day. My wife left me, I lost my job, I've got the flu and I just feel terrible. Well, that's okay, son. Did you have a drink today? No, sir. Well, then you had a good day. I did? Holy cow. All right. The first full paragraph on page 45. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. Boy, is this a radical concept. You mean to tell me my problem is not booze? You mean to tell me that my problem is not alcohol and the bars and all of this, the obsession and compulsion to drink? That's what we mean. Alcohol is a symptom of the underlying illness. And the basis of that illness, right at the bottom line of that illness, is lack of power. That was our dilemma. And we had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Notice that the word power is capitalized. This does not mean an AA group, nor does it mean a doorknob, ashtray, or pickup truck. The reason it is capitalized is because it refers to a deity, the God of our own understanding. It had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? Now that's the problem. The big book now has stated the problem. And as always, the next thing it's going to do is answer the problem. Give us the solution. And here's what the New Age AAers and the human solutionists don't want to read. The next paragraph. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. This book is not about not drinking. Nowhere in this book does it tell you don't drink. That would be a futile thing to say. It says find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. This is what we have to offer here, guys. We don't offer a non-drinking program. We offer a spiritual program where we go from a place of rebellion and defiance and denial to a place of surrender and obedience to a higher power. And that solves our problem. We do not offer human solutions here, in spite of the fact that we have a scurrilous little book called Living Sober, which has all kinds of human solutions in it. And that's fine. Read that thing after you've read the big book 6 times and gone through the steps and had at least 6 people that you sponsored. Then you can read it. Because at that point you're going to see just how far off base it is. It flatly contradicts the big book, and it tells you that it's nothing having to do with the big book or the steps. This is just a bunch of nice little things. I'm pretty sure they wrote that and published it so the treatment centers would have something they could get you to read. I think economics had something to do with that book. All right. The main object here is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. This is the solution we offer. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. Now notice this ties right in with the preceding paragraph, doesn't it? Where it talks about the fact that we may have had moral ideas galore. And we may have wished to live up to them, but we found that we could not. So now we're going the next step from code of morals to a spiritual way of life. You see how this works? So now we've added the extra part of the equation, spirituality, becoming spiritually fit, seeking and finding and surrendering to a power greater than ourselves, finding God. And then, of course, the next sentence says this. And it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God. No weasel words here. Big Book doesn't beat around the bush. I don't know why we do. There are no outs here. It doesn't say, oh, golly gee whiz, it might be that we just sort of might mention God in passing here. I hope it doesn't offend your sensibilities. Just flat out. This means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. And it does, over and over and over again. Remember when Bill wrote the steps, he did in about a half an hour. They just came flowing out. That night when he was sick and he was lying in his bed and he just started writing. There were the 200 words which are changing the world. And he looked at it after he had written it and he said, my gosh, there's God right up in the second step. Over and over again the steps refer to God or praying to God or referencing God. So there isn't any doubt about it, if you read the book and look at the steps, what this is all about. And that means, of course, then that this is going to be a problem for those who are still not willing to believe, and especially those who are not willing to believe that whatever power there might be out there could have any interest in them personally. A God personal to us. That's the problem. And Bill was able to solve that problem with Ebby's help. Remember what he said in his story. When Ebby came to him and he said, Bill, you can choose the power, choose a God or a power of your own understanding. You do not have to have my God or anybody else's. Choose your own conception of God, he said. And then he said, and Bill, the only thing that's necessary for you to recover is that you be willing to believe that there just might be a God out there, a power out there greater than yourself. And it was after that that Bill was able to get on his knees and say, God, if you are there, show yourself to me. And then he had his epiphany. He had that great spiritual experience, which he never lost. He said later, I learned I had to pray just as if there were a God. And then when the miracles started coming and I could no longer deny that they came from a power greater than myself, that's when faith came. He said faith was the greatest gift of all. Then if you will, please, would you open your books up to page 35. We're going to take a look now at the chapter 3 and what the big book tells us about the insanity of that first drink. The last half of the third chapter is devoted specifically to this subject. And it contains 2 stories of real people and 1 allegory. The stories are of Jim and Fred, and the allegory is the allegory of the jaywalker. So we want to take a good look at these. There's some wonderful stuff for us to learn here. aside from the fact that that insanity is prevalent in our disease. It's a part of our what we drag in here with us. You're going to see in these two stories and in the allegory that there are two very, very, very important points that are being made. Point number one is that we do not stay sober on fear. Point number two is that we do not stay sober on self-knowledge. Therefore, we have to wonder about those who would have us believe that our sobriety is contingent upon our keeping it green or remembering our last drunk. We're going to learn that there comes times when that memory is of absolutely no use to us. Or those who are purveyors of the human solution, who believe that if we learn enough about ourselves and why we drink or drug, that somehow magically we will stop doing so. And we're going to find out that self-knowledge does not keep us sober. In other words, this big book and the 12 steps in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous does not purvey or push upon the newcomer some idea of sobriety other than finding and surrendering and doing the will of a higher power. This is all we offer. We do not offer human solutions. Remember again the three pertinent ideas. No human power could relieve us of our alcoholism. God can and will if we seek Him. This is very, very important to remember. Now, on page 35, we commence the story of Jim. And Jim is a guy who had inherited a wonderful automobile dealership in his hometown. And he had everything going for him, a beautiful home, a family and kids. And he had a fine place in the society within his town, but Jim was a drunk. And he drank. And he ended up in asylums. He lost his business. He eventually sold it to another person. In one of his times when he was sober, he had gone back to work for this dealership as a salesman. And he was a tad bitter about this, of course, but nevertheless he had to make a living. In the meantime, Jim had run into the boys of AA, and they had taken Jim aside and they had said to Jim, look, if you're an alcoholic like us, there's going to come a time when nothing's going to stand between you and the next drink but a loving God, and you better have Him in your life. Well, Jim didn't believe any of this. He thought it was nonsense. He believed that he could do this himself. He wasn't going to buy any of this God stuff. He didn't want any idea of spiritual recovery. Well, Jim found out, and it was a kind of a strange way, but then we're going to follow him through here and see what happened to Jim. He had come to work one morning and had a little bit of a tip with his new boss, who was now the owner. Then he went out to see a customer, and he stopped at a roadhouse where he had often had lunch, just to eat his lunch. And he had done this many times. Turn to page 36, please. If we go down in the first full paragraph, about 4 lines up from the end of that paragraph. I sat down at a table and ordered a sandwich and a glass of milk. Still no thought of drinking. I ordered another sandwich and decided to have another glass of milk. Suddenly, the thought crossed my mind that if I were to put an ounce of whiskey in my milk, it couldn't hurt me on a full stomach. I ordered a whiskey and poured it into the milk. I vaguely sensed I was not being any too smart, but felt reassured as I was taking the whiskey on a full stomach. The experiment went so well, I ordered another whiskey and poured it into more milk. That didn't seem to bother me, so I tried another. Thus started one more journey to the asylum for Jim. Here was the threat of commitment, the loss of family and position, to say nothing of that intense mental and physical suffering which drinking always caused him. He had every reason to fear that next drink. He had every reason to think it through. He had every reason to recall his last drunk. But none of that crossed his mind. Here's what he says. He had much knowledge about himself as an alcoholic, yet all reasons for not drinking were easily pushed aside in favor of the foolish idea that he could take whiskey if only he mixed it with milk. Whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. How can such a lack of proportion of the ability to think straight be called anything else? You may think this an extreme case. To us, it is not far-fetched, for this kind of thinking has been characteristic of every single one of us. We have sometimes reflected more than Jim did upon the consequences, but there was always the curious mental phenomenon that parallel with our sound reasoning there inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking the first drink. Our sound reasoning failed to hold us in check. The insane idea won out. Next day we would ask ourselves in all earnestness and sincerity how it could have happened. In some circumstances, we've gone out deliberately to get drunk, feeling ourselves justified by nervousness, anger, worry, depression, jealousy, or the like. But even in this type of beginning, we are obliged to admit that our justification for a spree was insanely insufficient in the light of what always happened. We now see that when we began to drink deliberately, instead of casually, there was little serious or effective thought during the period of premeditation of what the terrific consequences might be. In this type of beginning, we are obliged to admit that our justification for a spree was insanely insufficient in the light of what always happened. We now see that when we began to drink deliberately, instead of casually, there was little serious or effective thought during the period of premeditation of what the terrific consequences might be. So you see, over and over again, the Big Book teaches us the same lessons. We need to learn these lessons, and it's very important for us to pass these lessons on when we share in our groups and our meetings. This is the message we ought to be carrying. Not that somehow magically the person who just goes to meetings and doesn't drink is going to stay sober. How is that? Where does that come from? If your butt falls off, put it into a little red wagon and drag it to a meeting. How about this one? Oh, sponsor, listen to me. I really feel terrible today. I got this terrible problem, and I don't know how to handle it, and I'm really feeling a whole lot like drinking today. Please help me. Well, did you have a drink today? No, sir. Well, you had a good day. It's an interesting concept because the paradox is that none of this is about not drinking. Nowhere in the Big Book does it say don't drink. It's not about not drinking. It's about overcoming the spiritual bankruptcy which we brought in here with us. It's about finding a power greater than ourselves which will solve our problem and staying with that power. It's about getting into God's pocket and staying there. It's the only place we're safe. Utterly useless for me to say to you, don't drink. And you can legitimately say to me, well, if I could just not drink, what the hell am I doing here? I don't need you. You may certainly ask it, sir.
There's a phrase in there I don't quite understand. We now see that when he began to drink deliberately, instead of casual, there was a serious effect of, look, now, what does that mean? It sounds like it means you can drink casually.
Well, what it's really referring, Tom asked this question. In the third paragraph on page 37, it talks about the difference between drinking casually or drinking after deliberation. And what is the difference? And what about this drinking casually? Well, what that's referring to is Jim's story. Exactly what he just recounted to us. Oh, it would seem, why don't I just have some whiskey in my milk? You know, it can't hurt me any. That would be to begin drinking casually. The same thing that we're going to find in Fred's story when we get there. The same thing happened to him. Without any premeditation, without any thought of getting drunk, just all of a sudden the thought crosses our minds, oh, this will be okay. We can get away with it. It's not going to hurt. The obverse of that, of course, is that we start building up to drink, sometimes a long time before we do it. We don't say anything to anybody. We don't do anything to try to sidetrack it. We feel totally justified in our actions. But that's, and the big book is telling us that we have these two different aspects of that first drink that we must contend with. But it's making the point, and I think rather powerfully, that even in those times when we deliberate the first drink, there was little or no thought given to the consequences. And see, that's the lesson here, that we're not really concerned about the consequences at all. Even though we pretend to be, and all the talk around the AA rooms is about the horrible consequences of having the next drink, and how that last spree and the last time we slipped, there's no better out there and it's terrible and all this stuff. But when it comes time and our brain is telling us it's time to drink, we don't think of those consequences at all. And even if we do, we pass them off as being unimportant. This is the illustration of the insanity of this stuff, Tom. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now then, at the bottom of page 37, we have the allegory of the jaywalker, and we're going to read this together as well, because although this is a made-up story, most of us are going to be able to identify ourselves with this guy. The last partial paragraph on page 37. Our behavior is as absurd and incomprehensible with respect to the first drink as that of an individual with a passion, say, for jaywalking. He gets a thrill out of skipping in front of fast-moving vehicles. He enjoys himself for a few years in spite of friendly warnings. Up to this point, you would label him as a foolish chap having queer ideas of fun. Luck then deserts him, and he is slightly injured several times in succession. You would expect him, if he were normal, to cut it out. Presently, he's hit again, and this time has a fractured skull. Within a week after leaving the hospital, a fast-moving trolley car breaks his arm. He tells you he has decided to stop jaywalking for good, but in a few weeks he breaks both legs. On through the years, this conduct continues, accompanied by his continual promises to be careful or to keep off the streets altogether. Finally, he can no longer work. His wife gets a divorce, and he's held up to ridicule. He tries every known means to get the jaywalking idea out of his head. He shuts himself up in an asylum, hoping to mend his ways. But the day he comes out, he races in front of a fire engine which breaks his back. Such a man would be crazy, wouldn't he? Pretty clear. You may think our illustration is too ridiculous, but is it? We who have been through the ringer have to admit, if we substituted alcoholism for jaywalking, illustration would fit us exactly. However intelligent we may have been in other respects where alcohol has been involved, we have been strangely insane. A strong language, but isn't it true? Now then, let's go to page 39, and we have here the story of Fred. Fred's a very interesting character. Fred was a wealthy guy. He was a professional, a certified public accountant. He was a partner in a well-known firm in New York City. He made excellent money. He was married, had the three and a half kids and the dog, a beautiful home. And he was a very successful guy, and everybody who knew Fred liked him and considered him to be extremely well balanced, and he had it all put together in his life. And whenever anything would happen that was a problem, Fred had always found a way to solve it. He was very self-sufficient. He was very smart. But there was just one problem. Fred was a drunk. And so Fred would get drunk, and one day he just overdid it. In fact, for several days he overdid it, and he ended up in the hospital. And while he's in the hospital drying out, and he had the shakes pretty bad, that's when the boys from AA caught up with him. And so they sat down and they told him what they knew about alcoholism and the disease and what it would do to people, and about how they had recovered, and they suggested to him that he might want to think about this too. Even his doctor said to him, "Fred, you may want to give some thought to this recovery from the alcoholism business, because it may very well be that you're afflicted." But Fred, though he was interested in what they had to say, was absolutely convinced that what he now knew about alcoholism was sufficient. He had plenty of knowledge about himself. He was certainly afraid of the consequences of drinking, that he might lose his position, maybe even lose his family or his life. But he was assured in his own mind that he had always conquered all of the other problems in his life, and he would conquer this one too. If you go down on page 39, 5 lines up from the bottom of the page, it never occurred to him that perhaps he could not do so. That is, he could not quit drinking altogether. In spite of his character and standing, Fred would not believe himself an alcoholic, much less accept a spiritual remedy for his problem. We told him what we knew about alcoholism. He was interested and conceded that he had some of the symptoms, but he was a long way from admitting that he could do nothing about it himself. He was positive that this humiliating experience, plus the knowledge he had acquired, would keep him sober the rest of his life. Self-knowledge would fix it. And Fred went about his life, secure in the knowledge that he had all of this knowledge about himself, and that he knew all the consequences of getting drunk, and that he just would never drink again. That this was a problem which he could very easily solve on his own. Fred went from New York to Washington, D.C. to testify before a committee, and it was very successful. And when he called his partners that afternoon to tell them in New York that what had happened, that it was very successful, he felt good. Physically he was strong, mentally he was strong, he was happy, was secure. He says on page 41, 6 lines down from the top of the page, it was the end of a perfect day, not a cloud on the horizon. Now let's see what happened to Fred. I went to my hotel and leisurely dressed for dinner. As I crossed the threshold of the dining room, the thought came to mind that it would be nice to have a couple of cocktails with dinner. That was all. Tom, you see, that's the casual stuff. Nothing more. I ordered a cocktail in my meal. Then I ordered another cocktail. After dinner, I decided to take a walk. When I returned to the hotel, it struck me a highball would be fine before going to bed, so I stopped in the bar and had one. I remember having several more that night and plenty next morning. I have a shadowy recollection of being in an airplane bound for New York and of finding a friendly taxi cab driver at the landing field, said of my wife. The driver escorted me about for several days. I know little of where I went or what I said and did. Then came the hospital with unbearable mental and physical suffering. As soon as I regained my ability to think, I went carefully over that evening in Washington. Not only had I been off guard, I had made no fight whatever against the first drink. This time I had not thought of the consequences at all. I had commenced to drink as carelessly as though the cocktails were ginger ale. I now remember what my alcoholic friends had told me, how they prophesied that if I had an alcoholic mind, the time and place would come I would drink again. They said that though I did raise a defense, it would one day give way before some trivial reason for having a drink. Well, just that did happen and more. Listen to this now. For what I had learned of alcoholism did not occur to me at all. I knew from that moment that I had an alcoholic mind. I saw that willpower and self-knowledge would not help in those strange mental blank spots. Memorize that phrase. Strange mental blank spots. This is what we're dealing with, guys, with this disease. We think that somehow or another that we can think our way out of the next drink, that we can be frightened out of the next drink, that we can have so much knowledge about what will happen that we won't drink. And yet, each of us has experienced these strange mental blank spots. I had never been able to understand people who said that a problem had them helplessly defeated. I knew then it was a crushing blow. That crushing blow undoubtedly saved Fred's life. Going down to the bottom of page 42, quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. The last thing that Fred wanted to have to admit or to deal with. Notice again, spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I have since been brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying, and I hope more useful than the life I had before. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. I would not go back to it even if I could. Fred has found a home in AA, and he's found a home in his spiritual life. Fred's story speaks for itself. We hope it strikes home to thousands like him. He had felt only the first nip of the wringer. Most of you are too young to remember that, but washing machines used to have ringers on them. At first you had to turn a crank. There was no rinse or spin cycle on washing machines. Later they became mechanized, and when they became motor driven, you could catch yourself in that wringer. It was rotating rollers, and you put the clothes through it. So he had only the first nip of the wringer. And you can imagine what could easily get caught in those things. It could be quite painful. Most alcoholics have to be pretty badly mangled before they really commence to solve their problems. Now let's go down to the bottom of page 43. Again, here is the rule. We have to remember these things, and it's real important to pass this on to those who come after us. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. The defense must come from a higher power. And every time you see the word must in this big book, remember that it means or else. And so there we have the background, real life stories and an allegory describing to us the insanity of that first drink, that next drink. That drink that we take in spite of the fact that we are fully aware of the consequences which will flow from that, and we have learned so much about ourselves, and yet we have no defense against that first drink. And so we see the futility of trying to get people to just not drink. How can we do that if we read this book and we know that they don't have the power. And so we're telling them to do something they can't do. And we're not telling them to do what they must do in order to recover. Recovery has to be a product of having sought and found and surrendered to and being obedient to a higher power. We don't have anything else we offer in here. At least we certainly don't have anything coming from the big book that we offer in here. Perhaps from outside sources, yes. If the outside stuff that we are taught actually worked, there'd be no need for AA, would there? There would be no reason for us to exist. For all of human history, the human solutions have been tried and they have always failed. And it was not until 65 years ago that we had the spiritual solution given to us. And the spiritual solution never fails. It always works. Provided, of course, that we do what we're supposed to do. So that gives us a pretty fair introduction then to the insanity that we carry in here with us. This is the insanity which we have come to believe God will solve for us. Turn to page 84, please. If you're working with somebody new, it's very important for them to see 84. Very important for them to see that this is not a vain act or a vain belief. That when we come to believe that God can restore us to sanity, it's the truth and it's going to happen. Bottom of page 84. This is in the following the 10th step. We have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally. And we will find that this has happened automatically. What an important word that is. What it's telling us is simply this, that if we have done the work of the steps, we are automatically granted this great gift of the return of our sanity. And that means we don't have to think our way through this stuff or philosophize our way through it or make up new ways of doing it or try to gild the lily or try to be different just for differentness' sake. All we have to do is follow the direction of this book. And if we do that, we automatically will be given the grace of the return to sanity. This is a direct promise, and it is true, and it is always true. And for somebody who is new, it would be something which would pump them full of hope, that when we ask them to take this second step, consider carefully doing the things necessary to come to a belief that God can restore them to sanity, that they will see there's a purpose in this. This is not just us trying to impose our particular spiritual beliefs on them, but this is leading to something. It's leading to the solution, and the solution is that in fact God does restore us to sanity. Period. Now, next week when we convene again, we're going to take a look at the 4th chapter, and we're going to see what has to happen here in order for this belief to come into being with us. We're going to look to see what the big book tells us is the test of the second step. We're going to look to see what the big book tells us about leaps of faith and trying to cross on the bridge of reason. We're going to look to see what the solutions are, including the fact that we can select and choose our own concept of a higher power. And the only thing that we must do is to become willing to believe that there just might be a power out there greater than ourselves. And we'll look at all of that next week, and this will lead us to the spiritual answer to the second step. And I want to thank all of you